Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Traffic and Transportation Decision Meeting. I'm Councillor Lynn Stagg, Cabinet Member for Traffic and Transportation. There's some housekeeping rules, safety information. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the Portsmouth Cultural Trust fire marshal regulations, anyone who signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should remember to sign up when leaving the building after today's meeting. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed, filmed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of the meeting room, and the recording will be on the Council's website. The camera will mainly capture the backs of anyone making deputations, but there will be some footage of them as they approach and leave the table where the microphones are located, and of people entering or leaving the room whilst the meeting is in progress. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. Please can everyone remember to use the microphones provided when they are speaking. Right, I'll introduce, having introduced myself, on my left is...
I'm Councillor Simon Bosher, I'm the Conservative spokesman for Traffic and Transportation.
Thank you. Nikki?
I'm Nikki Musson, Senior Transport Planner in the parking team.
Kevin McKee, Parking Manager.
Pam Turton, Assistant Director of Transport, and I'm afraid I have to give my apologies because I need to leave at about 5:45.
Peter Bell, City Solicitor.
Joanne Wildsmith, Democratic Services, and can I let you know that Councillor Heaney is on his way here from another council meeting.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest? Councillor Bosher?
No.
And we'll ask... Councillor Heaney, you've arrived just in time. Have you got any declarations of interest? That was a no for the sake of the film. Thank you very much. Right, we'll go on to Business Parking Programme Consultation, Reprioritisation. Are you introducing this, Kevin?
Thank you, Councillor Stagg. This report sets out priorities for consultation. It's not making a decision about implementing any particular zones, but just a programme of consultation. It needs to be considered against the rising level of vehicle ownership and finite amount of on-street space in the city. The parking pressures in the city are getting worse because of this. We've been developing a strategy to address the issues that have arisen from RPZ implementation. And alongside this, we're developing a comprehensive parking strategy, and this is being developed and should be reported towards the end of the financial year. In the report, paragraph 4.4 sets out the progress made on RPZ implementation since the report in July 2018. I think it demonstrates very significant progress, and it's a credit to Nikki and her colleagues that so much progress has been made. So the report presents a strategy for considering requests for new RPZs from across the city, prioritising them and dealing with displacement as part of a rolling programme. It also looks at reviewing existing zones. The increase in resources enables issues to be dealt with more swiftly. The report proposes 3 work streams, 2 dealing with new zones and 1 looking at improving existing zones. The work streams will work simultaneously, so the 3 areas of work will be progressed together. The plan on page 17, a large copy of which is behind us on the wall, sets out potential areas of for new RPZs, but it's to be stressed that this report only talks about the consultation for those areas. It does not necessarily mean that all the areas highlighted will get zones. When either of the first 2 work streams is complete, they will start on the next area in a priority list table given in table 4 and continue to look at displacement issues. So the recommendations in the report are that progress since the approval of the residence parking programme for consultation on the 31st of July 2018, described in Paragraph 4.4 is noted. That the residents' parking programme of consultation is divided into 3 work streams and prioritised as described in paragraph 6. Work streams 1 and 2 are progressed as set out in table 2 and described in paragraphs 6.2 to 6.6, and the work stream 3 is initially progressed using consultants as set out in table 3 and described in paragraph 6.7 and 6.10. When either work stream 1 or 2 is complete, the next area to be action will be determined in accordance with table 4. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I believe Councillor Peter Harris and Councillor Stubbs are speaking, doing deputations against. Am I right? Councillor Mason, are you making a deputation? Thank you. Right. Councillor Peter Harris, would you like to speak first?
Just trying to sort my laptop out, Councillor Stagg. Just give me a second.
Right, shall I go to Councillor Stubbs first?
No, I'm literally a second.
Okay.
Just need to log in. Yeah, so basically, Councillor Stagg, I'm just going to begin with the 3 northern zones that are on the reprioritisation project. So if we look at probably best to actually look at the map over there, to be fair. You've got the HK, HI and HJ zone. And obviously this is the workstream 3. So am I right, Kev, that you're saying this is going to be done with the consultants on this workstream 3?
No, that's part of workstream 2.
That's part of workstream 2.
New zones.
New zones. Okay, so we're going to go. Anyway, let me carry on. Doesn't really matter, to be fair. So I'm mainly going to pick out the HK zone. So obviously it's got a priority for consultation, and it says parking impressions are getting worse. Well, I've just done a little bit of quick maths. Over 500 zones are in that area in the HK zone, and there's about 14 requests within the zones if I actually go right on the boundary. So that's just under 3%. So in my mind, just under 3% requests for a zone isn't actually overall requests for actual consultation. So I think actually you're wasting your time and probably wasting council funds by doing that. And the actual HI and HK zone, if you look on the request map, which is in your pack, which I hope you've read as a cabinet member, if you look into that one, HJ I think has 3, and HI, if you're generous, probably has 4. So from my perspective, that's 1 request because it's the orange dot. So if you actually look up on there, well done Darren, you can find it. So if you actually look on that request, you're asking the officers to look at doing consultation on something that actually hasn't been requested. And that's not the officers' fault. That's a political priority from the administration. So I actually have quite a lot of concern about that. And why is it here? It's basically because of HC zone. Where if you look at HC zone, where the vicinity of where it is, it's actually going to, effectively you feel it's going to cause displacement, so that's why they're here. But if you look at the FD zone, which is already implemented, and then you look at the proposed HF zone and then the HK zone, you're actually having a pincer movement towards a certain area of the Hillsey ward, which does concern me, because that is much more, or I see a bigger problem, from the fact that you're going to take the actions today, that actually you're going to pile more misery on residents. So I think you have to be very careful about the decision you're making with the northern part of the city, because these aren't actually being requested en masse. It's not like we're in Southsea or we're in certain other areas where people do request parking zone. It's not happening here. So I think you have to be very careful, Councillor Stagg, and I think you should really look at this again and look at this in much more detail, because at the moment you're making a decision that fundamentally that residents haven't asked for. Thank you.
Ask Kevin to respond to that, please.
Yes, the programme from July 2018 highlighted HC, and the rest of the H zones are listed for consultation to deal with any potential displacement from HC if it was implemented.
Absolutely, Kev. I know we spoke about this in the week. Yes. I don't disagree with what you were saying. What I was saying is the fact that it's on here in this report, it's in the public domain, and I've got residents contacting me panicking because they haven't asked for a parking zone, and they've seen what's happened around the city with the ramming and railroading of MB and MC, and they don't want it to happen again.
I think all the report's asking is talking about is consultation.
I'm quite clear with what the report's asking. As I stated, it's a consultation. What I'm saying is it's a waste of the council's time to do the consultation. It's a waste of time and money, which is effectively what council taxpayers ask us to come here and talk about.
Can I say they will not be surveyed or consulted unless there are more requests. They are there as a potential.
Yeah, but why is it here then? If you're going to go on that thing, it's 3%. Why is it here?
It's potential impact.
So it shoulda, coulda, woulda.
Can I just finish? If HG does go ahead, and we don't know if it is going to go ahead, the initial impact would be on the immediate areas around, and then the impact if those request, I'll just finish.
That's
if
fine,
those
that's
request residence parking and they get voted in, then that would have an impact on the next one. So that's why we're looking at the impact across the city or across the area.
So residents in Hillsey Ward and Copnor would have to suffer because you want to put through one in HC. Okay, thank you.
I don't want to put one in through in AC. My residents have asked for it, and we
Okay,
have.
that's fair enough. I mean, if you want to put misery on other residents, that's fine.
Stubbs.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, this is... I put in a deputation request as much as a placeholder as anything else to see what anything might come up in discussions, any other deputations that will be made, and of course one of the advantages we get as councillors, we get to go last in the deputation list, and so if residents were here and a lot of points were made, it would have been an opportunity to make some comments off the back of it. I do think that what I've been saying many times, that there is nothing between leaving everything as it was and putting in MB and MC and end up doing the whole of Portsea Island, and I've said that many times, and I think it's coming true. And if you look at the map on the wall, if you remove the commercial areas in Cotner, around the dockyard, around Rodney Road, and you just look at the residential districts in the city, I think that must take us, I mean, it's difficult to work as a percentage, isn't it? But I mean, a good half, as I said, about half of Portsea Island's residential streets are covered in the areas shown on the map. And so, you know, you can see the effect of displacement moving further out, and I confidently make a prediction that it doesn't end here, that where you have districts, much of Milton Ward for an example, upwards, I would have said, into Hillsey and Cotner, that the displacement will continue, and that you will end up doing, in the end, after taking many years of doing it, what a lot of us have been predicting from the start, which is that it's not possible to expand residence parking without considering the overall position, without considering the displacement, and without effectively doing the whole of the island. All of that said, so far as my own ward is concerned, I think that this is an improvement to have recognition that you know, effectively the zones already created and in the pipeline will mean that Eastleigh and Craneswater Ward is going to be very much impacted by displaced parking, and that's going to reach, that isn't going to just end on those zones either. I mean, that very end bit down towards Fort Cumberland, that's going to get caught up too, and it's just completely obvious, and I think that that should be considered now. I think it's important to make some consideration, at least in the South Sea parts of the city, about the implications for business and for tourism, because obviously there are large numbers of visitors to the area in the summer months. There are businesses which trade all day, and frankly you can see them in the 10th hole as an example. It has quite a considerable impact on parking on that stretch of road. Now, were that to become, I'm imagining the way you're looking at this, a 2-hour residence parking zone, and were that during the day, then that would have a major effect on their business. I know you could say, well, people could park on the seafront and pay to do so and walk around, but I suspect in practice they wouldn't do that. And so, you know, that is something which needs some thought. Also, I note in the report it makes references to where some of these requests come from, and there's reference to councillors. Of course, I'm only one of the councillors for the ward, but I can say that what I've always advocated a city-wide, and you are going to have to do all of it, approach, I haven't specifically lobbied over this and the zones marked in here, so maybe it's referring to one of the other councillors, but I would like to confirm the accuracy of that. And I think that if you are going to go down this path, then it just needs to be done really as quickly as possible, if it's going to be done at all. And I still say that the right thing to have done would have been to have, at the start of this process, before doing MB and MC actually, to have given people right across the island outside of residence parking zones a decision about whether they want to do this and do the whole lot or leave things as they were.
Can I add a few things here? First of all, the number of cars in the city has increased, registered in the city has increased from 107,000 in 2007 to 128,600 at the end of last year. So that's an increase of, by my reckoning, 11,600 cars, without an increase in any parking spaces. It now works out that there are 1.37 cars per household. Now, outside most houses in Portsmouth, not all, there are some areas that do have residents, that have off-street parking. Most households are only the width of one car. Some are even less than that. So there are more cars than there are places for them to park. So if we could create more parking spaces, that's a possibility. However, I think we need to look at the other aspect as well, and that is that we are under a directive from DEFRA for our air pollution. We have to improve the quality of our air pollution. Now, 50% of our air pollution is created by vehicles, and most of those vehicles are caught up in congestion areas. If you go on any of the main roads, most times of the day, but particularly in the rush hours, your timing takes, your journeys take a long time. You mentioned at some point about economy. That affects the economy because every time something is held up, the economy is affected because it's costing more. So in addition to the air pollution, we have got the effects of air pollution. We know that between 95 and 100 people per year die each year from NO2, the effects of NO2. And that's just part of the emissions from vehicles. You've also got CO2, which is currently, I think that will be coming on stream a bit later in the year. Am I right, Kevin? Is CO2 emissions, are they being looked at?
The next item talks about CO2 emissions from vehicles.
But also you've got particulates, which cause not so much the immediate deaths, but they certainly cause things like asthma, COPD, and we have got many thousands of people in the city suffering from it. So in other words, what we're saying is we have too many vehicles in the city. They are causing major health problems as well as affecting the economy. There is no other way of, I can't find anywhere where we can build enough car parking space for all these extra vehicles. Somebody suggested on Great Saltons, this is one of the exhibitions we had in Copla. Unfortunately, Great Saltons is an old landfill site which is full of cadmium, lead, mercury, and I can't remember, cadmium, and it's not allowed to be built on. So there's nowhere else. We haven't got enough space, as you know, Councillor Stubbs, from your role with development of the city, regeneration, we have not got enough space to build houses, let alone to have car parks. So we have a problem right across the city, and it's severely contributed to by the number of vehicles in the city. The number of commercial vehicles has increased dramatically in the last 10 years as well, and a lot of those HGVs are chucking out lots of pollution. So it's not just the space, it's not just the economy, it's not just the health, it's all of them all together. Yes, Councillor Stubbs.
Can I ask you a follow-up question just out of that? There is also the air pollution report going to Cabinet next week, and one of the documents, I can't remember if it's the main one or one of the supporting ones, makes reference to the importance of reducing the number of parking spaces outside of the city centre in order to encourage modal shift. Is that one of the drivers for this residents' parking policy?
Not at all. The drivers has come from the residents. They have been asking for it. Since I've been a councillor, as soon as I was elected in 2007, residents in my area said, when are we going to have a parking zone? So that's coming from residents, it's not coming from us. But those are incidentals, if you like. I mean, they're important incidentals, but I would like to see that the city centre doesn't have parking spaces, my personal view, but I'm not involved in regeneration of the city centre. Councillor Bowsher, would you like to make any comments? Oh, my apologies, Councillor New. We weren't there in the beginning.
Sorry, I just came over with
sorry.
Councillor Mason from the Langston Harbour Board, so apologies that we were slightly late. I just wanted to ask a couple of things. First of all, I mean, I found it strange that given that the decision's now been taken for a reprioritise programme across Cobner, that it doesn't include places like Wesley Grove above Moncton. because those residents, again, it's the whole knock-on effect, the domino effect that we've talked about at length, that's going to continue. And it's going to continue to cause real misery for residents, certainly across my ward and also into Councillor Pater Harris's ward. But also I understand on top of this kind of salt in the wound approach anyway, that there's going to be a limit of up to 2 cars as well for these areas. Many of these areas are working class families who have got children that are now of the driving age. And while I know that you think that they contribute to the problem, and perhaps maybe across the whole city it does, it seems unfair that this whole area is now being targeted and will now also, I suppose, adversely impact onto their neighbours. And again, it seems to me that a lot of this is being done kind of like across political lines again, and which just seems, it just doesn't seem like a sensible way to be doing this. I mean, and I'm assuming that this is going to take a couple of years to roll out anyway. It's not going to be something that's going to happen by Christmas, when we'd previously had a discussion about various phases, what they could look like if this was to be the piecemeal approach that you were going to adopt. And so I just think it's going to cause such misery going forward. And just looking at this map, it just seems to be so hodgepodge. And dare I say, after the resistance from Copner residents to the proposed area for your own, where you live, it feels almost as if this is being done to kind of shut them down as some form of punishment. And that's their words, not mine. And that, you know, on top of that, with them, with this going ahead, because you're going to go through to your consultation, but looking at the proposed timeline, it looks like actually a lot of it's already been decided that this is what you're doing regardless. And on top of that, they're now going to be told that they can only have X amount of vehicles per household. And while I do agree that there needs to be some sort of radical solution to which nobody knows the answer in the long run, and there needs to be some sort of mindset shift, or whatever you want to call it, better use of public transport, etc. I think it's wrong that we should be saying to residents that you can only have up to X amount of vehicles per household. If they're paying road tax and they need them to get about, we shouldn't be telling people that they can't drive their cars. It almost says that this administration is against motorists and that they're using the current topical issue of air quality to try and ram it through. Now, I know many of the issues around air quality, especially in an island city, aren't easy to tackle, but a lot of that can be attributed to many things other than motoring. And there are some things or parts of the city that you will never solve these problems in as well, just because of the nature of the infrastructure that is there. And so even reducing the amount of vehicles, while it may help, it certainly won't eradicate the problems. And so I suppose really going back, my 2 points stand that it's going to impact onto Hilsey residents as well as other Copner residents, and this just seems to be very poorly thought out, you know, and I suppose additionally telling residents that they can only have up to 2 cars, I don't think it's going to go down well for you at all.
Right, can I clarify a few points? Or at least perhaps you could clarify them for me. Because on the one hand, you're saying the whole city is going to be affected as this rolls out. On the other hand, you are saying, your party is saying, we need a citywide scheme. So you can't have both.
Yeah, Councillor Stagg, I agree. I think we should have a citywide referendum to ask the people what they want. But given what you've presented here in front of me, it's going to affect my residents directly, both by having part of a zone imposed on them, and then other people in the ward that I represent who are going to be then affected by displacement from their own neighbours. And I look specifically to the areas around Vernon, Glenford, Moncton, and then all of the roads above that, right the way up until Wesley, up until where Roco is. And that seems, those roads are already very, very difficult to park in, to the point where people can't park their cars in the off-road parking down the alleyways because people park, say, half a foot over that entrance, and they then don't have the turning ability to get into those side roads which go down to access the old garages. This was also some of the areas that were pointed out previously in the last couple of years by the fire authority as difficult areas to get the fire stations down, I understand, fire trucks down. So those roads are going to be even more impacted.
Right. If you say having a citywide referendum, and some of those areas, the ones you're talking about, won't want residents parking, so how will they avoid having displacement from those areas that do?
Well, at the moment, what's happening is you're actually just forcing through a programme of residents parking onto people, whether they like it or not, and you're doing it through duplicitous means quite often, and that can't be right. If people can have a say on it, you will know whether they're in favour or against, and you would take it as a majority, I would suggest. It's not rocket science, and I suspect this argument's been made by many people more eloquently than I have.
So you mean if the whole city votes in favour, or the majority are in favour of the
That's
whole
how
city?
referendum generally works, although
Right,
you wouldn't think it
okay.
from the Brexit
So
referendum.
those who have residence parking now would lose it, and they'd have to suffer.
I suspect that there are probably a lot of people around the areas that you've already implemented that would like to see the back of them, like we saw in 2014.
2014, was that when MB and MC were taken out?
Yes, it was.
That was taken up by Councillor Ken
Elkin.
Elkin, from what I remember, because I think I was opposition spokesperson then, and that was without vote. That was undemocratic, and they
Well, I don't
they
think it
didn't have a
was.
vote on it. Shall I put it that way? All right, it was taken out. Yeah, but very true. Yes. My apologies. Yes.
I don't have anything else to add.
Anybody else? Councillor Sanders.
Well, I can't vouch for that, Simon. I have to say I'll do what you do, Simon, which is I didn't intend to speak, but once Rob came up, I thought, okay, well then it'll be one in, all in. Thank you, Simon. Just to return to Scott's earlier point around the consultations around Monkton Road and places like that not having enough people. One of the interesting things I found from listening to residents, there's this lovely guy at the exhibition at Copner, who came from Monkton Road, and I had a 5 to 10 minute discussion about the parking problems that Rob and Scott outlined. He said years ago, he may be wrong, but years ago, he'd done a petition to get parking permits in his area. Nothing had happened. So he was desperate years ago to get this sorted. And that's actually part of the problem. Because And actually, Rob has outlined some of the really thorny issues. He says it's a solution to which nobody knows the answer. That is sadly no use to people in Rob's ward, my ward, Luke's ward, and Scott's ward, and every ward across the city, Graham's ward as well, who face parking problems. So there has to be a solution. And unfortunately, there have been years of political failure. And that includes my party as well as our party, Lynn, as well as everyone else's. The approach has been, here's a road, let's do the road, let's not worry about the impact on anyone else, let's try it one road at a time. And it is a really difficult problem. I mean, I read the scrutiny report that Councillor Bosher finally got published, and I would like to thank Simon for that. And it was really very, very good. But one of its problems was it said, well, we need a citywide strategy without offering a basis on which to work. Because there are various solutions to this problem. Everybody knows it in political circles. You scrap all the zones, you have one zone across the city, you have a range of zones across the city, or you have a rolling programme. And it's one of those four. And if his report had said, I want a citywide zone, or if his report had said, people should have a vote on a citywide zone, I probably would have supported it. But it didn't, and that's not criticising Simon in any way, because he did a really very, very good report. But it did say it had a citywide strategy, and that, I think, is what this is. Because people have had real problems over the years. We've had people voting for parking zones and never got them. We've had people who wanted parking zones, voted for parking zones and had them taken away. We had people in, let's say, Fratton or Somerstown who actually didn't want to pay the first parking permit charge and so wanted the zone scrapped, who then found that they had a smaller version of the zone instead. We had an administration that was very keen to end piecemeal parking zones, absolutely fine, who then introduced the piecemeal parking zones in Gosham. This has to stop. And I think that the plan outlined today helps us to do that. And it has some interesting principles in it, which interest me greatly. The first is around the need for consultation. Now, I think the exhibitions that were held in Copney were very good. There were plenty of people who were really upset, plenty of people who were going, okay, this could work, and plenty of people who simply didn't believe that the council was going to say no, some of whom live in our ward, Lynn. And I think we need more of that. We cannot have a situation whereby people want them cancelled. We have to have more of them. The second is the precautionary principle, and this is partly where Scott, I think, is coming from. The HL area in our own ward in Baffins is in there. I have no idea whether there will be displacement parking from the other side of the railway line. But I think it's sensible that the precautionary principle is in there, and it is in there. And we need to do that more often because that's never done before. And finally, the impact on the environment which you've just mentioned, Lynn. This report does worry me in one sense because it goes against what Council has decided. Councillors at last full Council meeting decided not to include environmental issues in our parking policy. I think that's very sad. Some 5 minutes later then said, what are you doing about the climate emergency, which I thought was fun. But I hope from both Graham and from Simon that we'll get a commitment at least, even if they don't like the rolling programme, that there should be environmental issues included. Now, Rob and I have various bits of our area, have real issues with commercial vehicles. People haven't got much money at the end of the week, need their vans and stuff like that. And that's a fact that that this council has to deal with. Because we have lots of environmental commitments, most of it imposed by government. You and I both know that the Liberal Democrats don't want a clean air zone imposed on us by the government that covers cars and stops people actually going about their jobs. We've got to deal with that, but we've got to make sure all policies are linked to that, and that's got to include parking. So I welcome the strategy. I think it's good that we've got some dates which never occurred in the list 7 years ago. I understand the issues that Rob and Scott and Luke have raised, but I think the alternative is to do nothing, and that's just to say, well, this is an issue to which nobody knows the answer. And I don't think that's good enough for our residents. We all want to do better, and I think this is one way of doing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. There is.
We've got some written deputations, but we haven't got any registered.
I've got Laura Trowham coming for a later item. That's for the.
I have no objections that anybody can come and speak. I think it's important.
Councillor Norton's here as well.
Do you want to go straight to those, Councillor Stagg?
If you don't mind, Councillor Bosher, you've been waiting a long time. Do you mind? Fine. Yeah. Yes, I wasn't aware. I knew that Laura was on the list for the next one, wasn't it? Yes.
If I may, while we're waiting for them, Councillor Sanders made several references to my text report. I'd just like to clarify that actually it was a cross-party report which involved members of all parties in that particular instance, and the role of the Text Scrutiny Committee was to put forward recommendations to the Cabinet. It was not the role of the Text Scrutiny Committee to say how those things should be done. So it was the Cabinet decision not to go forward with one of the recommendations, even though it was, and to accept the others, which equally we didn't put plans in how it was to be done for any of the others. But just to clarify, it wasn't our role to put forward how it to be done, and it was a cross-party report which included members of your own party, Councillor Sanders.
Can I just add that I prefer that we didn't have any party politics in this, because it's got nothing to do with party politics at all. Councillor Norton.
Yeah, well, that was actually surprising. That was actually my point about party politics, really, because my concern here is that these all seem to have appeared on this map after a series of sessions that we've been out campaigning in areas where we're campaigning. So you have to strip this back, I think, as we often do, and say, as a resident, how do we feel about this, and what do residents think? And I think once again we're in a situation where residents for years have had survey after survey after survey stuffed through their door by the Liberal Democrats saying, do you want parking zones? We can do this, we can do that. They vote for the party only to find that nothing happens for a few years, and we look at maps and zones that sort of stay the same, yet the minute there's some action and we get out and campaign, all of a sudden this map changes very, very quickly. So I think, you know, a decision about whether these decisions can be put in quickly or not needs to be had. And if they can, then it would be nice to know, to think that
displacement parking isn't going to exist around these zones is ridiculous. And secondly, it's not residents' fault that we can't employ staff to implement these zones quicker. Why should they have to settle with misery when, you know, there's the likes of Councillor Pitt are saying, well, hold on a minute, we would have these in quicker if we were able to appoint the staff, and we've put out applications and no one's applied. That's not residents' fault. We need to get our house in order, really, before we put misery onto residents in these zones.
Thank you. Kevin, could you make a comment on the staffing issue?
Yes, certainly. I mean, we've increased the staffing on residence parking quite considerably. That's why we're progressing with 3 work streams, both in terms of the technical officers and the support for them. Because previously there's only been 1 work stream at one time, and we're looking at providing 3, although the 3rd one will rely on consultants. So the actual resource has gone up considerably.
But
it's an additional transport planner working 4 days a week, and 2 admin support or technical officers to support them.
we've also advertised and had no applicants, because it's a very technical, very specific area, and it's not just the technical know-how. And there's the lady who knows everything. She knows every yellow line in the city, believe me. But you need the local knowledge, and that's very, very important. But we have tried, which is why we're now looking at consultants to do some of the initial survey preparation, so that that can go ahead as fast as possible. If we can get more people, we will do it. The faster we do it, in response to people, not to push it forward, but in response to what residents are asking for.
Okay.
Councillor Bosher.
Sorry, just for clarification, the 2 other members of the public are on the other item, as per your list.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, still tend to forget that. Very well said, young man. Just I'm about to speak. I have that trouble with my grandchildren. Every time I look at them, they burst out crying on me. Now. I have some questions, just for clarification, if I can. 4.4, the last bullet point, 5 informal surveys undertaken, MBM, EHC, GB, MF zones. Residents updated with the survey results and the next steps. So that's obviously in the past tense. I haven't seen anything about HC. I've asked for it, but I've not seen any results. And I think my counterpart has also said he hasn't seen them either. I just wondered what those results for HC were.
The survey results are on the website, and all residents have been updated with the results of the survey. And it was because of that we went on then to the next level of consultation with the exhibitions, and it's that data that we're still processing at the moment.
That's the data. The exhibition is what you're still processing then.
So the informal survey that we undertook for HC has been published, and the residents have been updated, but now we've moved on to further consultation.
Okay, now I'll just come back on that. We've now got a swathe of zones introduced across the middle of the city, sort of like the H zones, for want of a better expression, which sort of have appeared out of nowhere, but I suspect they're on the basis of HC zone. Is that correct?
Displacement, potential displacement, yes.
So are we actually getting ahead of ourselves? Because if we're still collating the results for HC zone, we don't know what the result is going to be. Therefore, we don't necessarily know whether we're going to need all these other zones yet, do we?
Yeah, I think as a result of the exhibitions and what your colleagues were saying, people in Copner are very concerned about residence parking. They've also had a lot of requests from that area, and people like to see their areas on a programme so they know we're actually thinking about them and we might, do something about it, rather than just leave them to it. They are on the programme to be consulted.
They're not being, none of them are being imposed, but they are there for people to know this is the order if the demand is there, if the request is there.
There's sort of, yeah, I sort of hear where you're coming from, because there was a degree of concern, but the point I'm making is if we don't know what the final results are of the zone which is actually creating this concern across the middle of the city, then we don't know whether there's necessarily too much of a demand. Because I think Councillor Peter Harris actually pointed out some of these areas, the requests are absolutely minimal. But it sort of comes on to the second bit, and I'm hoping this is just a guessing game to going on certain bit, because we look at the table 2, you've got this work stream H, where you've effectively got the HC zone, informal and formal consultation. Is that July, August, September this year, so we're in the middle of that at this moment in time, informal and formal. But if we don't know the results about the informal yet, we don't know whether we're going to the formal one. But if we follow through with phase 2, phase 3 and phase 4, which are effectively all the other zones across the middle, they've all got formal down there, so I guess that's an assumption that if that is a decision that the informal says they want it, then that's when the formal is going to be. Is that the way we've been working this? Because it sort of gives the impression that there's going to have a formal consultation come what may. But if I'm reading this right, the impact zone HC, which is going to cause this issue, which is around the Highgate Road area, some of these people are going to be waiting until the back end of 2022. Well, that's what it is. You look at Emsworth, Thurburn and Cobden. That's what the report says, Councillor Stagg. The fourth quarter of 2022, before they potentially get, or third and fourth quarter, before they potentially get consulted. So some of these people could be waiting a good couple of years going through parking misery on the back of one zone that's been introduced. And the other issue I have comes within 6.4 of the actual report, where it goes on, and it's sort of in the second half. The informal survey results tell us that the parking problems are caused by residents, vehicles, rather than external factors. Because, and that's a statement of fact, if you look around, again, HC area, it is effectively pressure of residents' vehicles there, rather than having a significant destination like would be Albert Road or the seafront or the city centre or something like that. So what we've got here, and you can argue for the rest of the H zones, is residents' vehicles that we're actually looking at rather than anything else. So on the back of HC, we're basically telling the whole middle of the city, you're going to have to get rid of your cars, mate. That's what we're basically saying to them, because there is going to be a limit on the number of permits per household, which I suspect is going to be 1, if not 2 at best, isn't it?
It depends how many parking spaces are available. So in some roads, where the houses are very narrow, there will be probably less parking spaces than the number of houses. In other roads where the houses are wider, you will have more parking spaces available per household.
So a question to Kevin, if I can. And do we have any zones where we've actually issued more permits than there are available parking spaces?
There are zones, I think it's 4 or 5 zones where there's more permits than there are parking spaces. Zones can work on the basis of more permits than parking spaces, because at any one time or when the controls are working, people may be away, but obviously it adds pressure. You're right, the formal survey would only follow the informal survey, and with HC, when we did the informal survey, 80% of the people that responded were in favour of the zone. But because of the issue that we want, that we need to look at restricting or controlling the way residents park, we went out to exhibitions and put a number of propositions to the residents to see how they'd like the zone structured within that. And one of those options was limiting the number of permits. Another one was making people use their off-street parking spaces where they have them. Limiting the size of vehicles. And so what we've got back is we've been very open with the residents about what's needed to control HC, and we're looking at what what the best options are for doing that.
Don't forget as well, not every household has a car, so there will be some spare spaces.
I fully appreciate that, but those households still have to buy tickets for visitors and stuff like that. But yeah, but coming back to what you were saying about the informal survey, am I right in saying that when you consult residents within an area for a residence parking zone, we're on HC and we'll stick on HC in that respect, you're writing individually to the people within that zone?
We wrote to the people within HC and the area around it as well.
Did you write to the people around it, or were
Yes.
they the ones that were subject to the exhibitions?
Well, for the exhibitions, we wrote to the people around the area.
But when you go out to the first informal survey, you write to the people within the proposed zone. You don't write to the people outside of that zone. They only pick up on it if there is some sort of exhibition that goes on, as happened with HC. Am I right in that?
Are you thinking of the formal consultation? Because the informal survey is just to gather information from residents about any parking problems they have.
Yeah.
So we've identified an area as HC. It's not proposed zone because they've submitted petitions over the years. So they're on the survey programme. But that really just gathers information. And then from the information we gathered, they then gone to the exhibitions and included a wider area. The formal consultation, if it happens and then how it happens, will then be open to anyone to respond.
But we actually demark those within and outside the zone when it comes to the report.
Yeah, because we need to be clear who said what and from
And
where.
we've also proved in previous ones that some people are applying from the same address and getting their stuff counted twice, as happened with MC Zone.
Yeah, we're very good at verifying now who's
Okay.
I'll just say this is the first time that exhibitions have been held for the surrounding area, so we actually want to get in contact with the people around who might be probably will be affected by the zone. So it's better consultation than there has been ever as far as the residence parking zones are concerned.
Okay, just moving on to something. Sorry, Graham, I'll let you have a word in edgeways in a minute. I do promise. Just moving on a little bit. And Kevin mentioned it, and it's sort of alluded to. We're bringing in consultants to do some of work stream 3. How much is that going to cost?
And we'll get a price for each area when we do it.
So we don't know yet?
No.
Right, okay, so we don't know how much that's going to cost. Now, again, going to table 3 on big number 10, little number 6, if that makes... Why do we always do that with numbers on reports? I've seen it in governance and audit exactly the same, but I digress. You get 2-page numbers. We've got a table there which is a programme of consultation in existing zones. So these have got date of commencement, but these are zones that are yet to be resurveyed. Is that how I'm interpreting that?
Those are the existing parking zones, so they're in place now,
Yeah.
where residents have asked us to review the operation of the schemes to see if they could work better.
Right, and have they been started? Do they?
West Southsea was the next one on the programme. So the programme that was approved in July last year, these are retained on there.
So how do these fit in with these 3 work streams that you've got on the previous page in table 2?
They're supposed to be simultaneous, so work stream
Are they?
MH and the reviews of existing parking zones we're intending happen simultaneously.
Okay, and table 4, areas with new requests, so that's on 8/12 page number. Where do they fit into the programme?
I think as it says in the report, when resources from one of the work streams are freed up, they will then start on those new areas. At this stage, we don't know how far, because it's a programme of consultation, we don't at this stage know what residents will tell us, and we don't know if or how many of these zones would actually go in. So at some stage, we will have resource available to then start on that work stream.
Right, so if I just take the first one then, Nikki, KE, Pembroke Park, that's that little area and whatever, that was included on the 2015 Works programme.
Yes.
Now, if I go back to your work stream M and H, you've got it pretty clear all the way through as to which months you're looking to either informally or formally survey them going through. So if time becomes available, then it's probably going to be at the end of work stream M. And the first opportunity, somebody who said we want it, which was on the 2015 programme, is likely to be considered, is potentially the first quarter of 2021-22. Is that a reasonable assumption to make?
I think you have to look at them as estimated timescales.
I am. I'm looking at.
Yeah,
I'm guessing that the table that you put together here on page 9 has had some expertise in estimating the length of time it's going to take. I'm sorry if I'm not doing too long. So therefore, I'm looking at this programme, and Workstream H, which is going to be somebody else is going to be doing, is going to be effectively committed all the way through until the end of 2022, according to this. So reasonably, the person whoever is doing Workstream M, which is all the Southsea ones, is going to be free at the beginning of 2021. So somebody who was included on the programme in 2015, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them who've been waiting 4 years already, are going to have to wait effectively until the beginning of 2021 because we've had zones prioritised in other areas for whatever reason. I mean, this isn't so much Gerald's rolling programme, it's more Gerald's rolling misery, isn't it?
Can I just butt in here and say it very much depends how fast each one of the zones can be done and how many staff we can have. If we can get more staff in, the whole lot will be... Well,
I'm sorry, Councillor, but we know how roughly it is because you have a predetermined informal consultation period. It goes out on a certain thing and you ask people to apply by a certain date. Then you give yourself a little bit of time to collate the results, and then if you go make the decision, you go out to formal consultation, which is effectively a TRO, which has a statutory length of time. So you know roughly from what you're going to do from a month's consultation up front, give yourself a couple of weeks and then 21 days and whatever, you know that a consultation period is going to be a minimum of 2 to 3 months, and that's the same for all of them since we've been doing it.
But some of the zones are smaller than others. The bigger zones are going to take longer because obviously you've got more to go through, and some of them are much, much smaller.
Sorry, traffic regulation order is 21 days. It doesn't matter whether you've got a traffic regulation order going out for one house or 1,000 houses. It's still the same
But it takes
length of
longer
time.
to go through the surveys if you've got a bigger zone.
Well, not where you give people a time limitation on when they can reply.
We're probably jumping a little ahead because this is, to come back to it, a programme of consultation, and it's too early to be talking about which zones might or might not go in. So we've given estimated timeframes for the M, as you say, and H work streams, but at this stage we don't know which zones will or will not be implemented. So it is just really about consultation at this stage.
I just have my concerns about how this is actually being handled. Because if you go back to this time last year with the 2018 report, we just had the one zone HC. Now, all of a sudden, on the back of councillors in the area talking to their residents to find out their views, we suddenly have a swathe more go all the way around. In the same way that I'm rather interested in the fact that at the beginning of July 2018, we had an MF zone that was basically MF and MG size, and then 10 days later it suddenly became half the size and it's MF, and all of a sudden it's now gone back to where it was before. I mean, this is hokey-cokey of the fabulous kind, isn't it, really? I mean, we've gone from a big to a small to a big in 2 reports.
So would you prefer us to go with one thing, stick with it even if it's wrong, or if it hasn't been thought through, and we hadn't thought of various other bits and pieces? For example, Jerry there came back to Kevin with a lot of suggestions which we've taken on board. So, and on that sort of basis, things can change. It is a dynamic situation. It's always changing.
Well, I get where you're coming from, but it sort of demonstrates the wrong decision was taken by your leader, because the middle of July last year, MF was the size of MF and MG. That's the report that originally came forward that you actually withdrew. 10 days later, when Councillor Dowling had considered the report, it halved, and now we've gone back to where it was before. So at some point, somebody took a bit of a decision which turned out to be a bit of an oops, one way or the other. I just think this is, as I said, it's become Gerald's rolling misery, to be quite honest, because this is being driven by secret working parties. We know that, and all of a sudden things are coming in because you're getting it fundamentally wrong. But I'd best let Graham have a few words now. Sorry.
Go ahead, Councillor Heaney.
Well, I recognise it's 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and I recognise the press are not here, so I'm not sure how much of what we're saying is going to get reported. But I do want to do three things. I want to ask some detailed questions, and then I want to make some comments as well, if that's okay. I don't know whether Simon wants to make any comments as well or not, but I've got some comments here. In terms of the questions, there's a few detailed questions I wanted to ask. Just while we're still talking about the three schemes that were on the 2015 programme, why did they not get implemented? Why were they on the programme and never happened? Were they at the end of the list, or were they taken out? What happened to those three schemes that are listed here as having been on the 2015 programme, and then are now? I'll tell you which ones they are. I can find them. The one was the first one, the Pembroke Park one. It says it was included in the 2015 programme, so it has been there, obviously. The other one that says it was included on it was Doyle Court, and the other one that was included on the 2015 programme was Broome Square. So they were already in the programme. So the question is, why did they not get done? Were they taken out? Were they at the bottom of the list? How did they not get done in the programme to now appear at the bottom of the next list, if you like?
So we had the programme, as you say, from 2015, and we're working through that, and I think the progress reports from that programme will tell you where we got to, but you're right, we just didn't get to them. Yeah.
And was that because of resources or because they were taken out?
Because of resources,
So
we could only do...
They weren't taken out
only do
by
one
a
at a
decision.
time. Yeah, they were all sequential, so at that time the programme was we're doing one scheme after another, whereas now hopefully we can do it a bit quicker, working on two areas at once.
At that time, Nikki was the only one doing it. She was only part-time because she had lots of other work to do as well. So it was very difficult. Okay.
Yeah, okay, I'm just seeking clarification because I wasn't here at that time as a councillor, so I'm sort of trying to get a picture. I know Simon was, and he knows an awful lot more about what happened in the past than I do. And I'm obviously picking up
that question.
I'm picking up a few things.
I'm
picking up a few things from what he's saying, but I thought I would ask the officers my question about what happened to the programme, which is
we had a
helpful.
change in administration and they changed the priorities. Right, that's effectively what happened.
Yeah, okay. I'll come back to priorities in a moment because that's now what to talk about. The other question I wanted to ask about was the framework matrix for new RPZs. I think that's an interesting idea. I haven't seen that before, and I don't know if it has been there before, but it looks like an interesting thing. So obviously that's been applied to the areas in Table 4, which I understand. What I then wanted to ask was any form of priority matrix or framework or any sort applied to the schemes that are currently being proposed, i.e. HC and any others, and any earlier ones?
No, I think this is, Nikki, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the initial time that we've tried that. Is that right?
Yeah. The way that the M and H work streams are based on potential displacement and the concerns that residents have raised now, and we're just taking that as read, we wouldn't then go in and say, well, you don't score highly enough to be on the programme.
Right, okay. I did want to ask one final question, which relates to the MD King's review, which is scheduled according to this table as Q4, January, February, March. That's what it says. What I wanted to ask was if the review takes place in March, it's going to hit the PERD period, and people will not get a sense of what's actually happening until June, July, August, which means that there'll be a very long time before any issues that get raised can be dealt with. So can I ask that when that review takes place, because if I understand the decision correctly that we had at the Cabinet meeting was that it would be within 6 months, that if there are issues identified, which obviously we would want to resolve, we don't leave them to hit the purdah period and don't do anything about them, that we try to deal with them in the early part of the year, either January or February. I recognise there's a resource issue. I'm not trying to say, treat my area best because it's my area. I'm saying don't put the residents in a situation where they've identified problems and they have to wait another 3, 4, 5 months for it to be sorted out. Can we agree that?
Yes, we can. You're right. The decision was made that it would be reviewed within 6 months. So we'd be looking to send out some sort of feedback form after, say, 3, 4 months, and then and we wouldn't leave it till the end of March, and then, as you say, leave them hanging. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. So.
Sorry, but if you look at the same work stream, you've got MG, MH and MI, all the informal ones, all due to be considered in the same quarter there. I wouldn't like to think that we're suddenly going to go out to do lots of informal surveys on residence parking zones just before a local election. All the others are staggered, generally speaking, but I would have thought you should have brought that forward.
Yeah, it's quite easy. It's quite difficult to avoid, the political periods and purge and that. And they did want them surveyed all at the same time to avoid any concerns from a neighbouring area to say, well, they've been surveyed, I want to be surveyed. So they are all listed at the same time, and we'll do them as soon as we can.
Officers are very aware of the purdah, the problem that it causes, so they will do their utmost. Even if I have to horsewhip them, to do it. And they don't need that because they are very, very hard-working.
I don't think that would be allowed. Just to say, could we make sure that all the ward councillors get informed about what that consultation is, so we get a copy of the letter, whatever. Okay. Okay, well, I think that's enough questions. So I'm going to go on to my comments, which are sort of in 2 parts, really. First one is a more process one. I'm not complaining about the fact that councillors have come to do a deputation. That's absolutely fine. What I'm not quite sure about is the protocol for this, because I thought you always had to tell the executive in advance, at least maybe the day before, that you were actually going to do this, because I do think it's a bit odd for members to be parked in the public gallery and then suddenly to decide they're going to come and give a deputation just because somebody else has given a deputation, because I think that's slightly abusing the process, because we can have loads of people sitting in the gallery and all pouring out, and we could be here for hours and hours and hours. And I do think members should, and I'm sure that everyone should actually, adopt proposals. If you want to come, tell somebody in advance, even if it's the day before, and then come along. But don't just turn up and say, "Oh, I think I'll have a say about something now," because I think that's really very good use of our time. But that's my view.
That.
Standing orders say that members of the public have to give due notice the day before noon. Councillors don't have to. It's not specified in standing orders. I'm sure City Solicitor will back me up, but it's always useful to know, and I prepare you a list and that includes councillors when they've given their notice.
Well, can you say that if I was doing it, I would always tell the person beforehand I was coming. Right, just a couple of points on the report generally. I mean, I think this is an advance. We have made some advance. I congratulate the officers on attempting to put together a programme. It is not a strategic plan for the management of parking in residential and non-residential areas. This is not a strategic plan. It's a plan for how we consult about it. When the motion was passed at the council, I'm very pleased that the executive member for traffic actually supported the substantive motion at the end. What we had envisaged, and I think I may have said this in my comments, is that we needed to link together not only a timescale and a programme of areas, but also resources, i.e. resources we have to deliver and enforce, and also principles on which we were going to agree schemes. So, for example, making it clear to residents whether they were going to be offered 24-hour schemes or limited hours schemes or whatever, because it is difficult to know what the council is going to offer. Now, I know that, because it links to the resources issue, I think we know that enforcing 24-hour schemes is difficult because it is more intensive. The shorter hour ones do allow a more concentrated effort at enforcement. And either if we're going to say to people, we are only going to do limited hours once, well, let's be honest with people and say that's all we can afford to do. Let's not kid them. If you're saying we're going to give people whatever they want, and they want 24-hour ones, then you're going to have to give them 24-hour ones, and then find the resources to implement that, because otherwise it's no good. And I think the administration have got to set out their priorities. I think I maybe said at the council meeting last time that when I looked at the previous report, where it said the administration had changed its the priorities of the parking programme, and then turned the page to find out what those priorities were, they weren't there. I couldn't find them. They weren't mentioned, you know. So I didn't know what they were, and I had no idea what principles it was being based on. So I think we do need to include that, and I'd welcome a bit more clarity about that in the future. I'm hoping everyone will get that. In relation to the discussion about how we decide which parking zones, which areas are going to be surveyed and how we set up parking zones, I mean, I think this area in what's the purple area on the map, sort of highlights the problem here. Because obviously there are a group of residents in a particular set of roads who said they have a problem. So we have gone out and consulted informally with them about them wanting a parking scheme, and they seem to have said, oh yes, they want one. Now we've gone to a wider meeting, which I think was the one that was held in July, saying a load of residents want a parking scheme, what do you think? And the people around are saying, hang on a minute, if this comes in, this could affect me. And then we've got the sort of knock-on effects that everyone was talking about. And one of the interesting things that's in the matrix that I saw, which was scoring for the new schemes, was the issue, and I just remind myself, it says that areas located within a major trip attraction, shopping centre, hospital, or whatever. Because one of the interesting things about the area in the purple there is that there are no major industrial, educational, public service facilities around there. The reason that parking is a problem is because people have a lot of cars and other vehicles. And once you decide to pick an area, a part of that area, and say, well, because of these people have said, we want a parking scheme, we're going to do what the people want, you then immediately set up a whole host of problems for other people who are adjacent, who will be affected by the displacement implications of a small area taken as a scheme. So I think that this is where my argument about strategic choices comes in, that I think the council have got to make a decision about whether they are going to implement parking schemes just because people have got too many cars, or whether we are going to implement parking schemes where we know that there is a particular problem created by a hospital or a railway station or whatever. Because I think they are two different issues. And I think we need to make a decision about whether we are going to deal with the one I mentioned first. Because in a sense, Councillor Sanders is right. It's a never-ending problem. You can't solve that problem because it's created by the people who live there. And I'm not blaming them. That's just the way it is. So I think that the council and presumably the administration have to make a decision about, well, it's all very well saying people give people what they want, but sometimes what people want is not necessarily the best thing for everyone. So maybe a courageous decision has to be saying, well, actually, we don't want to go down this road. There is no overriding reason why we need a parking scheme in this area. Now, it's not my decision, but I think you need to think about that as the future. Because the alternative would be, in my view, if you are going to talk about HC as a scheme, you then surely have to survey the whole of that purple area, saying there are proposals for a parking scheme in some area which will affect you. What do you think? And then you take the totality of the whole area about whether people want or don't want the parking scheme. And that's the way you have to. It all depends. It all comes down to, in the end, which area you define is going to be your one to survey about a parking scheme. If you take a small area with a lot of concerns, you'll get loads of people supporting it, but then there'll be knock-on effects elsewhere. If you survey the wider area, because it doesn't have any other boundaries that could be impacted, then you might get a different result. But I think you have to think about how you do that. And as I say, I'm not in the position to make a decision about that, but I think that's what we've got to think about, and I hope the executive would think about that. Because I think going along the line we are of picking a small area and implementing it and then waiting months for another thing to happen is not the way to go. It's going to cause lots of aggro and angst for people, and I'm not sure that you should be doing that. And I think, as I've been talking for a long time, I'll shut up now and hopefully we're making a decision soon. Yeah.
Thank you. That draws us to a close. None of us is saying that this is the ideal solution. It is the best one we can come up with at this moment in time. It may change, and I think lots of things will change because if the number of cars in the city carries on. Sorry, there's a No, she is. She's for the next one. She's down for the next one. Sorry. As the number of cars increases in the city, we're going to have to address the problem. There just aren't enough parking spaces. There aren't enough spaces on our roads. We have congestion, etc. And I don't think we can just separate them out, Graham. I think they're all so much is intertwined these days, and it's not just traffic by any means. It's buildings as well. And I think we've got to look at planning conditions as well to improve things like that. So it's as I said, it's a dynamic situation. It's going to be changing. It's not going to be the same next year or the year after, I'm sure. But at this moment in time, I'm happy to accept the recommendations. There are shortfalls. I'm the first to admit it, but it's the best. I think all the alternatives will not work any better than we have here. So I'm happy to accept those. Right, we're going to go on now to agenda item number 4. Are you going to introduce this again, Kevin?
Yes, certainly, Councillor Stagg. Item 4. This is a revised report from the August meeting. I'd like to thank everybody for their comments and trust that this report resolves the ambiguities. The report recommends a number of improvements to the scheme. There's the recommendation to allow car sharing between two people living in different zones by allowing the same vehicle to be issued with permits for 2 zones. It recommends excluding student halls of residence from permit eligibility. This move is supported by the university's policies and it reduces the potential impact of a hall with hundreds of rooms and the impact that could have on the limited amount of space in on-street parking. It proposes changes to residents' parking charges for the first permit for each household. It recommends that if the first vehicle applied for is solely electric, that permit is free, and if the first permit is applied for a vehicle which emits less than 100 grams of CO2, then that permit is reduced to £15, 50% of the current rate. It recommends excluding vehicles registered before March 2001 from that because their emissions are not readily available, and it recommends excluding diesel vehicles because of their particulate emissions and other emissions. Any subsequent permit charges will be charged at the normal rate regardless of the emissions. So if somebody has one electric vehicle and that's the first permit they apply for, it would be free. If they have another electric vehicle, then that will be charged for at the second permit rate. And the reason for that is we want to encourage people to make the right choice in their first vehicle, but we don't want to encourage multiple vehicles. And the criteria of the CO2 emissions is based on CO2 emissions because it needs to be based on a criteria which is verifiable, so that both the residents and staff can check eligibility. The report also recommends reducing the third permit cost from 590 to 300 and not increasing it in January as was originally proposed. And that's to reduce displacement. There's a number of reports that people are just moving their third vehicles into uncontrolled areas. Also there's reports that people are buying large numbers of scratch cards to get a permit for their third vehicle, and that's currently cheaper than buying a third permit. The report also highlights the ability to create overlapping boundaries in zones. I think there's been a lot of talk about fuzzy boundaries. We need to do it with a TRO, but the report explains how we can do that. As I've also had comments about where a zone borders a non-controlled area. And whether we can include people in the non-controlled area who might be impacted by displacement. And we've done that on a number of occasions in Campbell Road in is it MB or MC when it was in MC when it was introduced. It's now going to be part of MD, but they were allowed to park in MC. We also do it in Zone LB in Somerston, in Elm Grove and Sedgley Close, which are technically outside the zone boundary, but they're able to apply for permits. And finally, the report looks at the need to limit permit issues in zones where there may be more cars than there are spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Stubbs, you wanted to speak on this? Yeah, okay, fine, yes, yeah. But would you like to come to the table? That's all I was going to ask you. And it's Laura, isn't it?
Yes.
Would you like to do your deputation now?
Yes, please. Thank you for giving me the time to speak today. I live in the area within potential RPZ MH. I can confirm that as a resident, there is currently a massive problem with displacement parking. Personally, as a resident, although I no longer own a car, I support the introduction of car permits. With the forthcoming introduction of the ME zone, although this is not yet introduced, we are already suffering from displacement parking, and we have decided as a family to scrap our own car. This has already happened. We have 2 small children, and we live in a flat-fronted terraced house, for clarification. This is partly for environmental concerns. You have seen my small son. I do not wish our city to be a polluted city for my son. We have taken this conscious decision to scrap our car and move to primarily a mode of cycling as a family. We will cycle primarily, walk, take the bus and borrow or rent a car as needed. But we have scrapped our family car, that modal shift that so many of you have been talking about today. Car parking in Southsea is difficult, that might be an understatement, but it's even worse on a bike. I ride a standard 2-wheeler bike with a baby seat. There isn't really anywhere to park your bike safely on a residential street. There are bikes parking around the rest of the city, you know, at the D-Day Museum, everywhere else there are bike stands. There isn't anywhere on a residential street in Southsea. Most people, most of us, face the choice of leaving your bike out the front, open to theft, or dragging it, wet, muddy, through your terraced house. As you can imagine, with a small crawling baby, that isn't ideal. This is just another discouragement to giving up a car, which we've taken anyway, but a car can simply be left on your street secure, residents parking or not. You can just leave it where you are. In my street, we have a charging bay for electric cars. We've just mentioned electric vehicles and permits being free for electric vehicles. But nobody in our street actually has an electric car yet the majority of us cycle. The electric vehicle bay set a precedent for providing infrastructure for more environmentally friendly options of transport. Given that there is a demonstrable desire to encourage lower polluting forms of transport amongst every member on the council, surely, I urge the council to increase funding for cycling infrastructure in order to make cycling a viable alternative in our city for many residents. Currently, that's not a viable alternative for many residents because, as I mentioned, of the lack of secure parking. I understand that there are plans for a small pilot scheme for bike hangers, but I wish to ask the council to consider implementing bike hangers in residential areas as soon as possible to encourage this modal shift. If you wish to reduce the number of cars, increase the priority for bikes. Increase the infrastructure. You're talking about providing all these things for cars, yet what are you providing for bikes to encourage this modal shift? These lockable bike cages, bike hangers, are only half the length of a car, yet they provide secure locking for 6 cycles. Hangers would make it easier for residents to switch to using bikes as a more frequent, or even in my case, their only form of transport from their home. I ask the council to consider the Dutch example in the 1970s, facing the similar problem of many cars. They did not at that point have a forward-going vision, but they invested in the cycling infrastructure and now they lead the world. I ask the council to take the bold step of increasing their cycling infrastructure to enable cycling to become accessible for more families and more residents in the city. Thank you for listening to me today. Please excuse me if I depart immediately.
Thank you very much, and apologies for the wait. And I hope your son, is it your son or?
My son.
He's okay. Yeah. Thank you. Councillor Stubbs. Well, where's Jerry?
Yeah, he's just coming in.
Right. Jerry, would you like to come and do your deputation? I didn't realise you were babysitting. I thought you disappeared. I didn't realise you were babysitting. I thought you just disappeared. Thank you.
I had a chat with Kevin during the week, so a lot of the points that I was going to make were really technical, so we've already covered those, so I'll keep this nice and short. But firstly, I don't accept that there's nothing we can do. I really don't accept there's nothing we can do. The problem is we've got far too many cars, so we have to find something to do about having far too many cars. Part of that solution will be to get people on bikes, and I think the previous deputation might have touched on that. A couple of other points I wanted to make, and I'll come back to my final point. Printed permits. Printed permits allow residents to feel better about who's parked in their zone in the residents-only time. Now, I know I've had a very online conversation with Simon about this, Councillor Bosher, and I understand there are some issues with people who don't have residence parking permits parking in residence parking zones in times that they're allowed to park there, but residents with permits not able to find a space being upset that people without permits are parked in the area that they think they've paid for. And I can understand that being a concern, but I think on balance, I would like to see a return to printed paper permits, but I see the issue as perhaps something for discussion. The next thing I wanted to cover was workmen and workwomen and permits. There's a problem. When you are a workman, you get called out in a rush to go somewhere to fix a broken washing machine or a broken pipe or whatever. You rock up at 5 to 2 and then find out that from 2 till 4 you can't park. And that's an issue because it means you won't be able to do the job or you risk getting a fine. I understand you could buy it online, but quite honestly, if you've ever tried it, it's a bit of a faff and it's a bit difficult and most people aren't going to do it. So my solution to that would be, why don't we give residents a couple of permits, a couple of daily permits, just give them to them and say every year, and say, why don't you use these when you need to? And if you need more, come and ask us. If it turns out you're asking for 10 a week, then there'll be a debate. But in the short term, why not? Right? It's not going to lose us a lot of revenue, and it would take away one of those issues. It does require thinking about, because it would be open to abuse, but I think it wouldn't be a crazy idea. I've got a couple of technical points, which I'm still keeping in here. Will allowances be made for shadow cars? And by shadow, I mean those cars that are registered in 2 zones when calculating the capacity of a zone. Because unless you're a particle physicist, it can't be in 2 places at once. So what are you going to do? Are you going to reduce the capacity even though the car's got a parking permit for it? Or what? I don't know exactly what can be done. And also, when a car is shared and a household has access to 2 cars, one of which is a shared electric car, which incurs no cost. And I know we're only talking about small amounts of money relatively, £30 to some people isn't small. Will they be charged the electric rate or the second car rate? And if they change the order in which they register their cars, does it incur different amounts? I know it sounds trivial, but it will come up and there will be arguments about it. So let's think about it in advance before it gets raised and deal with it and understand where we're going to sit with it. It doesn't have to be difficult. Lastly, well, to get fewer cars, we have to provide alternatives. And the alternatives have to be safe and attractive, not just trying to plug a small gap and throw a token at the thing. So we need to do something about that. And I would like to invite Lynn and Kevin to come with me on a bike ride from South Parade Pier to Queen Alexandra Hospital at 5 o'clock on a midweek day. And we'll go on the recommended route. And if you survive, then you'll understand why I've invited you. But lastly, I want to talk about fuzzy boundaries, because we've spoken about overlapping boundaries in the report, but we haven't spoken about fuzzy boundaries. And I understand there are difficulties and technicalities in implementing it, but by a fuzzy boundary, I mean if you live, let's assume that you live on the edge of on the eastern side of Winter Road, in other words, the other side of Zone ME, if you live there, every other car that's parked in ME is going to come into your roads. And that's because there's nowhere else to go. The cemetery is to the south, the old railway line is to the west, there's nowhere else to go. So why don't we say, if your road adjoins a new residence parking zone, then you can, if there is space in those zones, apply for a permit, even though you're not in them. Because otherwise, you will be getting all of the traffic from there, all of the cars that don't want to spend £30 or can't get a permit. So all of the builders' trucks, all of the vans, all of the everything else will all come into your streets, and there's nothing you can do until your zone comes around. So why don't we ameliorate that, even for places where there isn't a zone going in, and say, if your street is adjacent to a residence parking zone, then you should be allowed, if you want, no force, you don't have to apply for a residence parking permit in that nearest zone. And that was it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Stokes.
Thank you. I've got a few points to make about this, about the operation of residence parking schemes. I do think that the paper as a whole is a small step in the right direction, and I do have sympathy, agree with quite a lot of what's been said by other deputations. Just to start really on the final point about overlapping zones, I mean, I do think that's an important thing, and of course it's complicated because of course adjoining roads are of differing lengths. Some of them are very long. And an option is to have smaller zones instead. So don't have ME as a monolith, cut it into, I don't know, 4. And then if you live in the boundary of whichever one is adjoining to an MC, say, then MC is also cut into lots of smaller zones, and you get to park in the ones which are within, say, quarter of a mile from your house. So you get it does make it a bit more complicated if you were to have a description of which zone you were in, because you get to park in multiple different smaller zones. But the point is, what people want is they want to be able to park in a radius around where they live. And while you have made some concessions here about actually the very final road, the dividing road, what about the other roads that are also near to the boundary? And could something a bit smarter be done? On a couple of similar matters, so the 2-hour enforcement period, I mean, certainly some of the London boroughs have residence parking that applies for 5 minutes per day. For areas around railway stations, Bromley certainly does that. I'm sure some of the others do as well. And that means really you just set that up with a view to the walking path that the enforcement officers are going to take. In terms of charging, we've talked a bit about, there's been a bit of discussion about third cars, and I think one of the things you need to consider is the nature of the places where you're bringing in residence zones are now changing. So they were historically in the most congested places in Old Portsmouth. There clearly isn't room for people, or not very many anyway, to own 3 cars because there's so little parking space. As these zones extend further out and are driven primarily by displacement, there are areas in, say, for example, the eastern part of my ward, where owning 3 cars in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem if only a fairly small number of people do it, and therefore it's difficult to justify a punitive charge, and it's difficult perhaps to justify having a blanket policy saying you can't have a third vehicle unless you can come up with really good circumstances. I certainly think that that's something which is going to, if nothing else, need to be studied somewhat more fully. I was interested when Kevin, when he was speaking, made mention about forcing people to use their parking spaces, and about that being something which is an option, presumably for people with driveways and so forth. I would be quite concerned about that if that was to be a policy. I haven't seen it, and I must admit I've skim read this document. I haven't read it properly, so it might be hiding in there somewhere. It didn't jump out to me, but if that is your policy, I would like to hear you just expound a bit on that. And as for the number of permits versus the number of spaces, well, I mean, I live in KC, along the South Sea seafront, and for absolutely years there have been more permits issued than there are spaces by, I think, about 300, and it's reasonably manageable. And if you get home at 8 o'clock at night, you do have a problem, but if you get home at 6 o'clock at night, it's okay, except on a hot summer's day, but that's a whole different problem. So when there's residents there, in practice, it is usually possible to park, and I think, it would be an overreaction to ration permits just to the number of spaces. I don't think you need to do that. I think those are, that's it. Those are all the points I wish to make. Thank you.
Kevin, have you got any answers to some of these or comments to make?
Yes, thank you. In terms of the hours of control, the 2 hours or the 5 minutes, I mean, my recommendation would be it depends on what you're trying to control. If you're around shops or something, then a 5-minute zone or even a 2-hour zone might not be enough because you've got people constantly coming and going, the same around a hospital. But where you've got commuters or people that might stay a long period of time, then 2 hours is, or even less, is can be effective. In terms of the ratio of permits to spaces, I think in the tech report, Brighton were one of the people that gave evidence, and they have a limit on the number of permits of 110% of the capacity of the zone. The point Mr. Jerry Brown made was about how you count that, and particularly with shared permits. I mean, the numbers of permits, residence permits we count, don't include visitors permits, they don't include business permits, so it's always going to be an approximation, and it's always going to be a rough indication of what the demand is for that zone. Thank you.
Councillor Heaney, I'm going to go the other way around this time, okay?
Oh, sorry, thank you. I'm making a mistake. Couple of questions, I got caught out. Just to clarify about that I understood the overlapping values correctly. If this is implemented, then if somebody lives in Zone A and therefore they have pressure on the area, they can also park in Zone B, which is next door to it. So the question is it in any road in either of those zones, or is it only in the adjacent roads? Are you going to limit the roads they can park in?
Lots of Venn diagrams.
Or are you going to say it's the zone and you can park wherever you like? I mean, obviously people are not going to park, miles away from their home. They're going to park as close as they can. But the question is, are you going to limit the roads?
I think the answer to that is that we will devise a dual boundary or an overlapping boundary in response to what's actually happening. We've got 36 parking zones in the city at the moment, and this hasn't come up before, or it has to a lesser extent. And obviously, if you haven't lived in one of those areas, you won't be aware of any consultations or mitigating measures that we've put forward. But obviously, those residents are. So as Kevin mentioned, we've got a couple of zones where permit entitlement, for example, has been extended to roads that aren't within the zone. I think it sort of came to our attention when we gave residents of Campbell Road MC zone permits ahead of an MD zone coming in. And now that they've all had their permits changed to MD permits, and Campbell Road is in that zone, they're much happier. I think, as you can see from the plan behind me, we have a lot of zones that are next to each other, and it hasn't been necessary to create a dual boundary. But if that does come up in Southsea, there are things that we can do. I think when the MD zone went for approval, we asked that Waverley Road was taken out, and then if we propose a zone next to that, we might make it for D and MF, for example, zone permit holders, and it might work that way. But really, we need to look at it as a case-by-case basis and see what would work. I don't really want a set policy that might not apply for every single occasion, because we don't actually have experience of it being needed at the moment.
But if I pick up correctly from what you're saying, you are going to provide some limit on the roads that these people can park in, because you're not saying it's going to be the whole zone. You're saying it's close to the boundary, so there will be some sort of a limit on where they can go. That's the principle you're going to operate. So you'll operate a principle that there will be a limit to the amount of roads that people with these dual permits can do
Yeah,
it.
it wouldn't be a case that it could be used in either zone. Yeah, you're right.
I mean, it's more a comment as well. I mean, I hear from Councillor Stubbs about the KC working in terms of the number of permits and the number of spaces. And I'm not quite sure why it does work, but it does. What I'm not sure about is whether the intention of the council, the cabinet member, is to use the parking permit scheme as a way of trying to require people to give up their cars, because it could be interpreted like that. If you're saying you're going to define an area, an artificial area which is a parking zone, and we are only going to issue 1 permit, 2 permits maximum, and there are more cars in that area than there are space, or you said there's a maximum number of permits going to be issued, then you will say to people who've lived there for remember how many years, now we've decided to create this artificial zone, you're going to lose out because your car won't be able to park, even though if you've had your car for 10, 12, whatever years. I think you need to think about that carefully before you do that, because I think some people will complain about it. I recognise that we want to encourage people to reduce the number of cars they have, but I don't think the car parking permit scheme is the ideal way of doing it.
I think that is just an additional thing that has come along. It's nothing to do with the residence parking zones, but when you look at it and look at the problems we have now, it is partly a way of doing it, but that's not the reason for doing it. Do you understand what I mean? It has.
No.
Well, we're not introducing residence parking zones anyway as a policy. It is just when residents ask for them and they vote in favour of them. Okay.
You say you're not introducing residence parking zones as a policy. Of course you are.
It's not a policy for the whole city. It is
a policy. It is a policy to introduce parking zones, and you say it's where residents want them. So it could be anywhere that can.
It is in response to residents' requests, and residents' requests come in where they have a parking problem, which can be for a number of reasons. It could be because, as it's a business zone, it's an entertainment zone, it's a shopping area, or what have you. But the requests come in some areas. I mean, for example, a lady asked me to go out to see problems in Stanshaw. And this is the flat-fronted houses, and she said, that house there, she said, look at, there's a camper van, 3 very large vans and 3 cars. They all belong to the one house. There's 7 vehicles. So that is a problem in that area. That may not be true for other areas. But it is not our policy to say we will introduce a parking zone. I said, if you want a parking zone, you've got to have enough people requesting it. So it comes as a request. So we have to have a policy to deal with how with those requests, but it is not an imposed policy at all.
I don't know, find them in a different world to you, but a policy which says you will implement parking schemes when residents want them seems to me to be a policy, as I would define it. But there we are. I will probably leave that one there.
Councillor Bosher.
I think it's a coalition of Conservative and Labour going on over here, because I thought it was a policy, to be quite honest. I've got a few comments to make. Firstly, if I can thank Kevin, because this report was somewhat full of ambiguities last time, and I've had a few conversations with him recently and whatever, and I think the whole thing has been tidied up very nicely. I did make some comments to him the other day when I met with him about some aspects of its implementation, which I think he satisfied me a little bit. One of the ones that I highlighted was what if somebody applies for, let's say, 2 permits in their house at the same time. I was being a touch on the sexist side, I didn't mean to, but let's say the gentleman of the house is actually the person who does the 2 parking permits. Sod's Law says that he's going to put his own permit in as the first permit, in the same way that whoever's putting their permit in, whoever's typing the information into the computer, is likely to put their own car's information in first. That's probably human nature as much as anything. And if the second car happens to be the electric car, then they miss out on their free permit. There is going to be some logistics with those sorts of things, and I think Denise assured me that we could probably do something about that if both the permit applications sort of arrived one after the other, that they could do some jiggery-pokery there. Because I could just see a potential issue for the officers being on the receiving end of some irate emails and phone calls if they feel that they're paying £30 and £80 when actually they could get free and 80 or whatever the second permit is actually in that respect. So as long as we've got some flexibility around that aspect of it, i.e. when a household is doing their two permits at the same time, then we're just going to save some officer misery, I think, unnecessarily. But I think that's more of a logistical thing as much as anything else. Fuzzy boundaries. Well, actually, I look at this the other way around. And why are we actually getting these? Well, Mr. Brown sort of highlighted it pretty well in what he was actually saying was if you live just outside a boundary, why don't you get a permit so that you can park inside a boundary when everybody else that doesn't want to pay for a second or third permit in the adjacent zone actually comes and parks in your street? Which is sort of the result of a piecemeal approach, isn't it? Because that's effectively what we're looking at. If I live in a road just outside a boundary, the inference being, give me a permit even though I'm just outside the zone so that I can park in the zone when my road's full up. But my road's going to be full up with all the displaced traffic. What you've done, just going back to that map with regards to the Cotner area, is almost a strategy, which is what we've all been saying for a long time, in the fact that you need a strategy. But what's actually been happening is since the reintroduction of MB and MC, the report carried a nice little phrase, and I can't remember exactly the words, was along the lines of where adjacent areas suffer from displacement, they will be considered a priority and be looked at as soon as possible. There were words to that effect. So what's been happening since the reintroduction of MB and MC is everybody that's having the displaced traffic has been shouting. So we've ended up with creep, effectively, a bit and a bit and a bit, going out and spreading out. But with HC zone, somebody's actually said there is going to be a problem here, which we probably could have told you because of the residential nature anyway, and so has looked to address it with a wider strategy. The trouble is, if you're going to do a wider strategy, you need to look at a more serious way of consulting it rather than doing it piecemeal over the next 2 or 3 years. And so it comes back to things like fuzzy boundaries. That's why we're looking at overlapping boundaries, or the way you want to do it, because we have a piecemeal approach. We're not looking at areas, and as Councillor Stubbs pointed out to a certain degree, having an area where, or the Cotner area, where we're actually looking at a larger area and putting it down into zones and doing a consultation with people on the basis that they can see the bigger picture of their geographical area. We're talking about it from a point of view of a few streets in a lot of instances, particularly if you look at HC. There's not a large number of streets involved in that, and people are looking at it from a point of view of what's directly outside their own front door and not thinking about a community-wide point of view. That's the reason why we're looking at fuzzy boundaries, and that's the reason why we're considering what sounds like a very complicated solution to a problem which is actually quite a simple one, and that is look at a wider strategy for lots of areas that keeps it simplistic in the eyes of the residents. It comes back to what I said about the last report which we're talking about and all the ambiguities. If you put something in place that can be interpreted in half a dozen different ways, which is what I demonstrated last time round, you are going to cause confusion with residents. You cause confusion and you get angry residents, which is exactly where we are with a lot of these issues. You start introducing fuzzy boundaries and stuff like that to get over what is effectively displaced traffic, displaced car parking on the basis of a piecemeal approach rather than a strategy, and you are going to start to complicate the issue with regards to where people can and can't park. And then you're going to have people that think they can park in some road because they think it's fuzzy or otherwise, end up with a parking ticket, and the people that take all the problems are the poor CEOs out on the street. if it comes back to it, if you had a strategy, a bigger citywide strategy maybe, as the cross-party committee actually recommended, you would have a more simplistic approach for the benefit of residents, that it was easy to understand, easy to implement, and easy and cost-effective to administer. And I think that's where we're getting it wrong, because both this report and the previous report effectively tie that together, and that's where we need to be.
Any comments from any of the officers? I don't want to put you...
Well, no, all I was going to say is no matter how big the zone you have is, you're still going to have boundaries. And I think the issue is that if you're on a boundary, you can't park on the other side of the boundary. So I think that's the argument about fuzzy boundaries, allowing people the maximum amount of choice around their home.
Can I just say...
Sorry, but the point I'm making, Kevin, is if you, let's say you take MB, MC, MD and that whole geographical area in blue and green in the middle of that particular map, if you'd looked at that as a strategic location, as you put in place with regards to Copner at this moment in time, because what's happened previously over the last sort of 18 months is that there's been a bit by bit by bit approach to, let's call them the M's at the bottom. Need to add a bit, need to add a bit, need to add a bit. But the controversy around HC, somebody has suddenly sat down and come up with, 9 or 10 residence parking zones in one hit, which is a strategy, albeit. All I'm saying is you're still looking to do that bit by bit by bit. Now, I know there's a capacity issue with officers, which is what we've highlighted in the previous one, but if you look to informally survey the whole area in one go, so that they can look at it and say, there's going to be 9 zones here, and they can understand it, then collectively you could get the majority saying, no, we don't want a zone on the one hand. But if they saw the bigger picture, rather than suddenly find themselves, as was the case with HC, the other side of Copner Road, suddenly finding out, potentially, when they suddenly can't come home and park anywhere within a country mile, not they can now anyway, of their own road, to find out it's because there's a residence parking zone that's popped in across the road, then you're actually going to get you're perhaps going to get a more meaningful engagement if it's done bigger. If you've done MB, MC, let's say MD, MF and all those in one area so that people could see how it was going to be broken up, that was the bigger map, you wouldn't necessarily have angry residents and you wouldn't necessarily have the need for fuzzy boundaries to appease people that are suddenly finding vehicles parked in their roads, which is what we're talking about.
Thank you. I think we leave it there. I would just say one thing, and this is something that is evolving because everything is changing. As I said earlier on, we've had an increase in the number of cars registered in Portsmouth in the last 11 years by 11,600. And if that continues, it's going to impact everywhere. And I understand Councillor Scott Pater's comments about Hillsey. I mean, that's an area that is not affected now. But if more and more people do get cars in that area, let alone the displacement, it's going to be a citywide problem. And it's not unique to Portsmouth. This is happening all over the country, in all cities. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the parking department, because you've worked damned hard, not just at getting the residence parking zones set up, but also working out these policies and listening to a lot of people as well. And I think that's something that is important. We do listen, and the officers, I mean, I just sort of front it up, but the officers do listen to what comments people make, and I'm sure a lot of the comments you've made today and that other people have made will be taken on board. We can't always do every one of them that are suggested, but at least they're taken on board. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.
Have you agreed the recommendations? Have you agreed the recommendations?
Sorry, yes, I have agreed the recommendation. Sorry.